Hi, you're listening to an older episode. The podcast is now called Travel Writing World. You can find the episode show notes and much more at travelwritingworld.com. This is Jeremy Bassetti, and you're listening to All Over the Place, a podcast on travel, culture, and the creative life. Today's episode brings us to London, where I speak with Monisha Rajesh about trains, slow travel, and her new book, Around the World in 80 Trains. She is a journalist and the author of Around India in 80 Trains, and her work has appeared in Condé Nast Traveler, The Guardian, Time Magazine, and the New York Times. But first, a few updates. So there aren't a lot of updates to report. A few days ago, I went to Tampa to meet Matt Kepnes of Nomadic Matt fame while he was on tour promoting his new book. He agreed to come on the podcast to talk about his new book, so watch out for that episode to drop in the next few weeks. Hopefully by the end of August, that will go live. I'm almost nearly done editing a manuscript that I've been working on lately. It's related to studying abroad, so I'm looking for a few sharp eyes to review the manuscript for some critical feedback. So if that sounds vaguely interesting, send me an email or slide into my DMs, as the young folks say, on Twitter, and then we'll be in touch. So that's about it for this week. So here is the conversation with Monisha Rajesh. Well, I am speaking with Monisha Rajesh about her new book, Around the World in 80 Trains. It's a fast-paced book, not just about the characters one meets in travel, but also about the, histories and cultures one encounters abroad, and about the journey itself. So, Monisha, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So this book was published probably 3 months ago now. And I definitely want to talk about the book. But first, I would like to, if that's okay with you, kind of get into a little bit about your background and your travel experience before we go there. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself? How do you see yourself? And how does writing kind of fit into your life?
Yeah, sure. So I trained as a journalist. I actually read French at university, and then I went on to do a master's at City University in London. So I trained as a journalist, and I worked across quite a lot of different publications, doing feature writing, bit of reporting, sub-editing, copy editing, all sorts of different things, just to sort of get a feel for what I thought was my sort of direction in life. Mm-hmm. And I was actually working at Time Magazine when I came up with the idea to do my first book, which was Around India in 80 Trains. And it actually just came about because I was fact-checking a piece, and I've read this article about how India's domestic airlines could connect 80 cities. And so I pulled up a map and I had a look, and I was just fascinated by how many different cities there were that I had never heard of, and how far these routes extended around the country. Because I'd lived in India very briefly when I was about 9 years old, for 2 years, because I was born and grew up in the UK. Mm-hmm. And my family and I moved back to India, and then it didn't really work out. So we came back, and I had never really gone to India again after that, certainly not for an extended period of time. And I always felt like there was a book in there somewhere. Mm-hmm. And when I looked at this map, I thought, wow, what a fantastic way to travel around. But I thought, it's a huge carbon footprint by traveling, around India by 80 planes.
Right.
And then I saw this, this network all over the map, this really fine, like embroidery almost. And when I looked at the key, it said it was the Indian Railways. And it was absolutely magnificent. And it went everywhere you could imagine, to just the nooks and crannies of the country, up mountains, right down the edges of every coast and into the villages that, no other form of transport could get to. And I thought, well, how about, traveling around India in 80 trains? And that's actually that was how fast the idea for the first book came about. And a couple of months later, I set off. I just took my savings and I bought an Indian rail pass for 3 months, and I went off, and I actually spent about 4.5 months traveling around the length and breadth of the country by trains. And that became my first book. So after that, travel writing became my sort of my stomping ground.
Mm-hmm.
And trains just became a part of everything that I did when I traveled. And it wasn't conscious, but I just found, wherever I went, I would hear hoots of trains in city centres, and I'd think, oh, wow, let's go and check out somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just do a little day trip out. And it became just part of the way I travelled. And so I guess it wasn't, a big surprise to anyone that I was very ready to get back on the rails. And so I ended up trying to come up with an idea for, not necessarily to replicate what I did in India, but to see if I could find, a similar country where there was this color and energy and incredible stories from passengers on trains.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, I decided that there was nowhere that could really match up to it, and I should just extend my remit and travel around the world by train. Because also, I think I was quite conscious that people have been sort of dismissing train travel recently and saying slow travel doesn't really have a place anymore. And, people have budget airlines, they've got bullet trains. Everybody wants to get everywhere faster and more efficiently. And I just wasn't convinced by this. I just felt like there's always going to be a love of slow travel, and the romance of the railways must exist somewhere. And that was my basic premise of the book, was to set out to find out whether this still existed for people.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about slow and fast travel. So what do you think some of the benefits or pleasures associated with traveling slowly are?
Well, I think now, because people just, everything we do just has to be faster and more efficient, and we want high speed internet, and everything's quicker. But you sort of wonder what we're actually doing with all this time that we're saving, and I'm not sure that we are really maximizing it. And I feel like we're losing out a lot of things. And with travel especially, I think that actual joy of the journey has got a little bit lost with the way that we travel now. And it's only really if people take gap years or go on extended, round the world trips that you really get to embrace that again. And I found when I did my round the world trip by rail, for me, the kind of the holiday starts and the adventure starts from the moment I've got on that train. I don't have to wait to get to the city or whichever country I'm heading to. It's there the minute you get on, even arriving at the station, and you hear the new sound, the passengers that you can observe, the food that you can smell, the different compartments, what they look like, what the bedding is like, the conductors, all these huge personalities that you meet on board as well. You're never tired, you're never bored by what you see, and there's always something going on to fire your imagination. And I think for me, that's a really important part of the travel. It's not just about where you're ending up at the end. And I think with train travel for me specifically, it's one of those methods of transport that allows you to do whatever you want to do, and it doesn't really interfere with getting from A to B. So you can get on a train and you can read for the whole journey if you want to. You can catch up on Game of Thrones episodes that you've downloaded. You can sit in the doorway with a cup of tea. You can chat to your neighbors. You can go and sniff out the dining car. You can do anything you want, and you will still get to your destination. And you almost don't even realize that you've spent all this time on board a train. And it's very few people who will tell you that they're bored and they're itching to get to their destination, because there's just so much to do and to see and people to talk to. And I found that most of the best stories that I got from my book and the adventures that I had took place on board, rather than when I finally actually ended up at my destination.
Yeah, you're so right about that. When you think about air travel, passengers are like cargo a little bit, right? And the point of or one of the pleasures of being on a plane is not having to engage or not wanting to interact with the person sitting next to you. I've been on a train, obviously, a few, many times in the past. Never any over any long distances like you have. But there is a different sense of liberty one has on a train when compared to
For
traveling
sure.
on an airplane.
Yeah. I mean, I think most people have a phobia when they're bored of who are we going to end up sitting, and you start sort of heading to your seat. You see the number approaching, and you're looking, thinking, "Oh God, please don't let that be my seat." But at least with trains, you move. If you more or less able to wander freely. You can go and spend your whole journey in the dining car. You can lean out the door. You can just shuffle around. But more often than not, you're not really stuck next to one person or another and facing one direction. You've got a lovely compartment with 5 or 6 different people, and they change. Over maybe a sort of 7 or 8 hour journey, you could be with so many different people rotating in and out of those seats. And that's the other bit that I used to love when I was on a really long overnight journey. You'd get into your berth, and you'd sort of 2 of them would still be empty. And you look at the door just thinking, these new people are going to come in. And at some point, the narrative is going to change over the next day, because no matter who comes in, you're going to get a different story from them. And they're going to have stuff to tell you that, it's so different from the person that had that birth before. And they can change. They make your story something totally unique in a way that you just don't get on planes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there's some references to your book, especially in the title, right? Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. And I was wondering if that was just kind of like a marketing decision, or if the writings of Jules Verne actually, or the writings of other travel writers, people like Paul Theroux, who in his, The Great Railway Bazaar, writes about kind of the romance of the rail. So like, do you have any literary influences?
Yeah, I guess. Honestly, I didn't really read a lot of travel before I did my books, because also, when I first set off to do my first book, I didn't specifically go to write a book about trains. I wanted to write a story about India and what India was like in, I wrote it in 2012. And it was my choice to go back and reassess the country after I'd left it 20 years before. And I didn't really see it as a travel book when I went there. It was more about what I had found 20 years later. And it was just the railways that were the method by which I could get around the country. But the book became a sort of homage to the railways, because I found just this beauty and this amazing, sense of community. And it was like a separate world that was on the railways that I had never realized existed. And even friends in India said to me, you've kind of traveled on these trains in a way that none of us ever had, and found out stuff that we didn't even know existed on our back doors. And so I think because I suddenly discovered that I actually love trains through my book, the next one it was just a nice goal. It was a nice format, around the world in 80 trains. It fitted nicely. It gave me a quite nice formula for how I wanted to travel. Because also there are thousands and thousands of different trains that I could have picked, but having 80 it gave me a nice type figure to limit it to. And actually, it sounded like a lot to a lot of people, but it really wasn't that many. And once I'd come up with 10 or 15 key journeys, like the Trans-Mongolian, the Canadian, the Pacific Starlight in the US, and some really kind of signature trains, I suddenly found that it was actually quite hard to then cut back the connecting journeys in between. And it was very easy to fill up, all the connecting trains to make it 80 and then bring me back to London. But I certainly did read when I was writing my first book. I did read Paul Theroux, and I read, Eric Newby was one of my favorites. He's just so funny more than anything, and I've loved most of Jeff Dyer's books. Very entertaining, and it was nice to read a sort of a very different, spectrum of travel writers. But for the most part, I found that I couldn't really relate to them and their perspectives on travel. And I think that's because travel writing has largely been dominated by white men. It's always been the sort of, their preserve. And I couldn't relate to that. And there was often a tendency to sort of place themselves at the center of this narrative and, write about the country purely through their own eyes and what they saw the minute they arrived, and they'd spend a week there and make their judgments and then leave. And I guess for me, I guess maybe there's an element of imposter syndrome there, but I didn't think what my opinions were were particularly valid when I arrived somewhere, because you can't make a judgment after a week or even a month about even a year maybe of being in a place. And I wanted perspectives of the people that I met and the people on the ground to come through and to allow their stories to be told rather than projecting my ideas about a place onto people. So I tried to keep myself sort of held back a little bit from the second book. And so you'll find that I think a lot of the chapters are very much told through the people that I met, and their stories come forward a lot more to paint the image of what I could see there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, but it is changing. I mean, there are a lot more writers now coming forward with, not specifically, it's difficult to put travel into, a genre as such, because there are so many different books that you could say are travel. I mean, even if you read Dickens,
mm-hmm.
you get taken back to a London that you've never been to before. You can't really even imagine. And you're transported. You've still been taken away to a village or a town that, you've never seen and you've never been in. And I think travel writing is very broad. It's a very, very broad term now, I think.
Sure. A few things here, I guess to touch on. Are you familiar with Monocle magazine?
Yeah, absolutely.
So they have a podcast, and I'll put a link in the show notes. It's a subset of one of their podcasts about magazine writing, and they recently went to a hotel somewhere in London, Bankside, something like that. And the hotel owner or manager had commissioned a bookshelf with nothing but travel books.
Oh, wow.
And they were tasked with, rethinking this notion of travel narratives and travel books.
Okay.
So they have all types of different, I guess, genres of travel books, even, narratives about space travel and kind of these introspective narratives. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. This idea of travel writing is quite broad, but I guess part of the trouble that they had compiling this is that they didn't want it to be merely this kind of collection of colonial exploits by white men.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I want to touch on the race thing, I guess not just the race and gender thing from the perspective of a writer, but also from the perspective of a traveler. I want to get there, but before we kind of go off in that direction, you'd mentioned something about living in India and Madras maybe for about 2 years when you were 9. And you said it didn't work out, and I guess I was just wondering, why it didn't work out, and then if it didn't work out, why were you kind of compelled to go back and rediscover that as an adult?
Yeah, so both my parents are doctors, and they only ever came over to the UK to train, and their intention was never to stay. So after about 14 years of us being here, my dad decided to go back, and within 6 months, not even 6 months, 3 months probably, they just found that India wasn't home anymore. And they'd always said, we're going to be going back home to India. And then they realized when they reached there that home had changed and home was now England. They'd spent 14 years of their life there. They'd had their kids there. And I think they didn't realize quite how much they'd got accustomed to living in England, that they just couldn't get used to being back in India again. And things had really changed in India for them as well. I mean, they left in the mid-70s. And when they came back in the sort of early 90s, it was, it's become extremely corrupt. Everyone had to bribe everybody to just get very straightforward things done, like having a gas cylinder fitted in your kitchen or getting milk coupons. You have to pay everyone to get bumped up the list. And they were just, I guess there was a sense of naivety on their behalf that they thought India would still be this kind of lovely 1970s happy place, and people were very different. And even, friends that they had worked with in the past had changed, and the way people did things in the hospitals had changed. And my parents were they were very unsettled by it all. And I think also because my brother and I had been at school in the UK, we got very used to the schooling system, and it was very hard to adapt to the Indian schooling system. And I had to catch up on sort of 7 or 8 years worth of Hindi and Sanskrit, which was very tough. Until finally, I think it was just, there were a few incidences where my parents were just horrified by the level of corruption, and just knowing that they weren't going to ever be able to adapt to that way of living. they just decided that the best place for all of us was just to come back. And so I think, I struggled a bit. I was bullied at school for having an English accent. And then when I got back to England, I was bullied for having an Indian accent. And it was an odd period for me. But I guess as kids, you just take it on the chin and you don't give it much thought. But over about sort of 20 years, I went back on holiday occasionally and for family weddings and things, but there was never an extended trip. I never really went back and sort of sunk my teeth into it. And I had so many friends from university who'd gone back and done big gap years and spent months and months, touring the hippie trail. And they'd always come back and tell me what a fantastic place it was and describe all these incredible monuments and beaches and forts and palaces. And I thought, I would really love to go back and see all of this one day as a tourist. And so that was why I decided to finally go. I thought, 20 years has passed. It's enough time. Things have changed. And everyone's talking about, India version 2.0. It's all taken off. It's the fastest growing democracy in the world. And I was curious to see this just, from everyone else's perspective. So that's why I took myself off and decided to see what I thought. And it was a good thing to do because I did, challenge a lot of my own prejudices about the country and managed to wrestle a lot of those old demons and come back actually having a much better feeling about the place. And I had a much better idea as well of where, India's one of those places where you have to you do have to figure out where you fit into it and where it fits into you. And it doesn't suit everybody. But it was definitely a very good thing to challenge myself with. And I really enjoyed it. And I think one of the other things that was really important to me was to bring out a book that it didn't, just a different book from the kind of books that I'd been seeing around a lot. Because like you just mentioned, there's very much a tendency towards this post-colonial narrative with travel writing. And I used to keep reading articles about India that I felt were very patronizing. There's this tendency to exoticize India, and you would always see book covers with, mangoes and women wearing bindis and saris, and it would always be in the Ganges, and everything seemed to be about either, forced marriage or weddings or holy bathing. And I thought that there's a lot of, 20-somethings working in tech and living in Bombay and wearing jeans, and you never hear about these people, and you never get to hear their voices. And I wanted to bring a book to market that would, bring that side of things out instead of always seeing people in terms of the other and strange and exotic. And it was really nice to be able to do that as someone who is not entirely English, but also not entirely Indian either. And I think I sort of straddled both those nicely to be able to have the sort of insider-outsider view of seeing my country from, I could understand nuance in language and dialect and mannerisms and certain types of food that I just immediately understood. And also just the way Indians do things is, very different from, the way people do things abroad. But equally, I could see it from a sort of outsider perspective and learn those, different ways of doing things too. So it was a challenge, but also a nice one to be able to do that and to give a nice measured approach to writing about India in a way that I didn't feel many people were doing. And I hope that I did that justice.
The question that comes to mind now is, the West, we hear a lot of, in the media, we see a lot of, aggression towards women in India. And this is a topic that your new book brings up, but it also has an element of, of race. So my question is how is traveling not just in India but around the world, not just as a woman but a woman of color? How have you been able to kind of deal with that? What are your observations? Do they confirm what we see in the media, or is it more complicated and nuanced?
It is a complex thing, and I think that's why when you sort of talked about reading travel writing before, I couldn't really relate to it because there was this, travel writers men anyway, no matter what color they are, I think, sort of go into situations with a confidence that I think most women don't have. And you sort of grow up knowing that when you walk into a strange space, there's always a sort of small element of threat or danger or uncertainty, I think. And that men I think they don't understand and they can't relate to. And, if you walk into a restaurant in suburban Russia as a white man, you won't be looked at in the same way that a black woman would be, because they just don't see anybody like that there. And I did feel very uncomfortable a lot of the time in Russia, even though I did this time around. I traveled with my, then fiance, now husband, and he's mixed race. His mum is Indonesian and his father was half English Lithuanian. But at the same time, you could tell that people still looked at us with wariness, trepidation. And I think on both sides there was an element of, who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you on this train? Why are you in our small town? What are you doing? And I could really sense it. I could feel it in a way that I don't in big cities, traveling in New York or living in London or living in Paris. You don't feel it in the same way, because you see people around all the time who are, so many different colors and, genders. And it's not something that I've been fortunate enough not to think about. But as soon as you come out of that, comfort zone and that bubble, I guess, that we live in, and you suddenly realize that actually, Eastern Europe is very, very white, and people are very threatened by seeing people of color. And I have heard some terrible stories from black writers who said, they will get approached in a restaurant and asked to fetch a menu without people realizing that they're not staff, they're also staying at the hotel.
Wow.
And I know that I've had I had a couple of Nigerian friends who've had quite severe racial abuse in Delhi, and I know that Indians can be incredibly racist. They're very discriminatory towards Northeast Indians who have facial features that are, they look a lot more Chinese. They've, got Tibetan influence. They have very Asiatic features, and when they come to Delhi, they are very, very singled out. They're ostracized. They often get beaten up, and it's something that I guess because I have a lot of friends who are people of color, you hear a very different set of stories from people when they travel. And in fact, funnily enough, one of the reviews that I got, which was the only review that was written by a woman for my book, she opened it by saying how demoralizing it was to read a book by a woman who had taken her husband with her on the trip. And it was quite striking to me, because I thought that's coming from a position of white privilege, where as a white woman, you can travel around a lot more safely than I can. And you have no concept of the fact that you could walk around in suburban Russia and get away with it and be fine. And you could, vanish off into different places and be very well received. Because I think, on the other side of that post-colonial narrative, you still have people welcomed, white people are still welcomed in with a little bit of that colonial attitude of being garlanded and put on a pedestal, and people take pictures of them because they're a novelty. And you wouldn't understand what it's like to be a brown woman, to turn up somewhere and not be viewed in that same way. And I was very aware of the way I have been received in certain places, which is part of the reason why my husband came with me. But it certainly did open, having him there did open doors to so many more places that I would probably not have ventured to on my own otherwise. And it certainly gave me just a sort of added comfort that I could just go out and do things on my own and not have to worry about it. And even though we traveled together, I still went off on my own and I did my own thing during the day, and we'd meet up in the evening and chat about what we'd been up to. So I certainly wasn't he wasn't by my side like a bodyguard the whole time. But it also brought just a kind of interesting dimension to travel, because this concept of solo travel now is just something that I've read about a lot recently, and it's something that I feel is very much directed at women. Solo travel is really important. Why everyone should go traveling alone. And you don't really see a lot of pieces by men about their solo travel. And I do feel like it's quite a Western construct, this idea, because whenever you travel in India, you always see people in enormous groups. Families go out in groups of 10 or 15. You have huge groups of college friends out together. Traveling alone is it's not really something people do. It's almost seemed like a very it's quite an alienating thing to do. And, why would you not want to travel with your friends or partner if you could, and share those experiences and have fun together? And it is something that I did notice a lot in a lot of countries, where they would sort of look at single travelers and think, why are you doing this by yourself? Is it because you have no friends to go with? And they feel sad, that there was a single woman on her own. Oh, it's really sad that you're not married. And in China, I remember a woman, I think she was from North England somewhere, who was on one of our trains. And the student we were chatting to was saying how sad it was that she was by herself. And he felt terrible that she had nobody to be with. And it was quite interesting for me that, everywhere you travel, in the West, it's not really a big deal when people travel on their own. But for, in Asian cultures, there was a real sort of sympathy towards her for being by herself. And it's very much something that I've considered a lot. And I think the nicest thing about just traveling with people is that you build memories together. You see things in a different way when you're with somebody else. But also you certainly get to learn a lot about the other person when you're traveling, because when you see someone at their lowest, when they're tired or they're hungry or they're ill, you get to see the real person and who they really are. Mm-hmm. And it's very telling. And it's I think, especially when you're about to marry that person, it's a good way of finding out what they're going to be like in the future. Yeah. It absolutely is. It's great. And when you're sharing a sort of 6x8 compartment with someone for 7 months, I think if you can sort of manage that and not kill each other, you're probably going to be okay from then on.
Yeah. Conversely, though, solo travel, it's something that I enjoy, but it gives you the opportunity to learn about yourself in a way that
absolutely. And I did it for. Yeah, sure. I mean, I did it a lot. Even with my India trip, I set off with a photographer friend of a friend, but we went our separate ways for various reasons. And the chunks of time I had on my own were just as valuable as when we were together. And it like you said, you find out a lot about yourself, about your ability to be alone, your what you're able to manage, what you're challenge yourself, and to just meeting people in a very strange place and taking yourself out of your comfort zone is a very important thing to do, I think. And also it's quite nice being on your own, because you don't have to conform to anything. You can be whoever you want to be. You can your narrative can be whatever you want it to be. You can eat when you want, you can sleep when you want, you can you don't want to go and see tourist spots, you don't have to do that. It's very liberating. And yes, I do actually think it's a great thing to do at various points. And I think it just suits you at different times of life, travel, whether it's solo or with people, or, a combination of.
Mm. I want to circle back, if you don't mind, to the story that you gave about the reviewer. I guess the white woman. And just to see if I understood you correctly. So in that conversation, you had mentioned the difficulties of traveling around the world as a woman of color, that a Caucasian or a white woman doesn't necessarily understand. In traveling in India, as a woman of color, my question is, does that bestow some privilege that a Caucasian woman might not have in India? Or is there still this notion of a white privilege in India because of the colonial past, looking perhaps at the Caucasian woman as economically superior, or as a source of perhaps economic gain?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, I think I can comment with India because I've been there enough now. But I think when I was on my own traveling around, people were very friendly. They were really helpful because they recognized immediately that while I wasn't obviously, Indian born and bred, I was certainly, one of them. And so they were really curious about what I was doing over there and why had I come back, and, everything. They wanted to know everything about my family and what had sort of compelled me to want to come and spend 5 months traveling around by train, which was certainly not something that most, women on their own were doing. And they were very kind. But equally, I did still feel I had moments where I wasn't very comfortable, and I had to go and, take myself off into a hotel early in the evening and just stay there, because I knew that in quiet towns, it just wasn't the place to wander around by myself if I had no one there to touch base with. And you can sense it. And I think I find it awful that, often the onus is placed on women to cover up and protect themselves and stay off the streets and not make eye contact. But I had to be a realist as well and know that that was just the situation there. And men in these smaller towns aren't used to seeing single women out by themselves. And I just didn't want to invite any trouble. And so, unfortunately, I did just have to sort of take most of those measures. And from time to time, I did think, this is quite boring being in a hotel at 7 o'clock in the evening watching TV, but it's just the better option for me right now if I'm by myself. But I did find that equally I felt very sorry for a lot of, white women that were traveling around, because they are still seen as, exotic and exciting and different, especially when you're not in the big cities. And you would see people just being generally very curious. And I think there is that interest of, that sort of the white overlord to some degree is, they're going to be very wealthy. So children would always kind of migrate straight towards them. And I recently had a friend who went out to India with his partner, and they're a gay couple. And he said people just assumed that we were in a band because we were traveling together. And he said they would always, and he said they just wanted to take pictures of us at breakfast, and they wanted to take pictures of us at lunch. And he said at the station, they just came towards us. He's a hipster from northeast London, but then they both got their big beards. And he said people kept asking if we had been in a band. And I think there is still that fascination of, what are these white people doing out here? What are they doing here? They're so different to look at, and they do different things, and they wear different clothes, and people are always amused when they see them sweating over food. And there is still the other. There is that sort of curiosity of the other, but for the most part, I found it non-threatening, and I haven't heard horror stories from friends. And I think a lot of women I know, single women, who've travelled quite comfortably in India and felt quite safe there, and that's a good thing. But obviously, I'm fully aware of the horror stories and the issues that can take place over there. And I think you do just have to be vigilant, unfortunately. And it's going to take a long time, and not just in India, world round. It's going to take a while before women can just walk around absolutely safely and not have to be worried about themselves. And it is a very unfortunate situation, but I think you do have to be realistic when you travel and take those, precautions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the United States, we often hear the horror stories that take place abroad.
Yeah.
And we, don't put as much attention on the horror stories that occur, at home.
Yeah.
And so the irony here being that just as many kind of bad things happen here at home as they do abroad, but we tend to focus our attentions on the person on holiday or
Sure.
In the United States, there's this big to-do about some deaths that have been occurring in the Dominican Republic. I don't know if you've heard about them. But there's a lot.
Yes, I have actually.
And so there's a big to-do, and I mean, it's unfortunate that anyone died abroad, but there are now questions and attention being placed on Caribbean travel in much the same sorts of ways that, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, that there were some questions about traveling to places like Mexico as an inherently unsafe and inherently dangerous place. People are quick to come to conclusions about that. But the beauty, I guess, of travel is you learn those fears typically are overstated, or while everybody must be cautious abroad, typically those fears and concerns are overstated. Yeah. So, the focusing on your book now, many of, I guess, the American audience will understand this. We have a tendency to romanticize the European rail network, right? We think about backpacking in Europe and taking the Eurail and doing all that. But your book starts off in Europe, and from what I understood, Europe was disappointing and it was a letdown. Could you explain what you think about the European rail network in particular?
Well, I think for what I was looking for, it came across as a letdown because, I wanted stories. I wanted to meet passengers. I wanted to find out things. I wanted to see, incredible scenery from the windows. And I just didn't get that. I think because The trains are fantastic. Don't let it be said that they're disappointing because they don't run or they don't work or they're inefficient. They are very efficient. In fact, too efficient. There was no delay. There was no cancellation. I was never forced to sit and make conversation with my passengers because of delays. Where often some of the best adventures would happen. But they're very punctual. They're clean. They're very fast. They're excellent bullet trains. And it just all worked so smoothly that there was just nothing for me to see or really get my teeth into and engage with. And I think because it was lovely, it just all worked very well. But nobody wants to read about the stuff that just works well. It's very dull, and they want to read about the breakdowns and the cancellations and the rickety trains and the smells you can get through the broken windows. And European trains were great. There was nothing to comment on. They were just very vanilla. And so after a few weeks, I thought, I've seen what I needed to see. I've seen the beaches. I've, been on the trains. I've had the lovely wine and then the foie gras. And, I'm ready for a proper adventure to start now. And that's when I sort of took off and headed up towards Moscow. But no, certainly wouldn't want your listeners to be put off because if you have a Europe Rail Pass, it's a brilliant thing to take if you just plan on staying in Europe and you have 28 days for a month, I think it is. So, sorry, 28 countries in a month. And that's a huge amount of places to try and visit. But even if you pick 4 or 5 over a month, it's a great way to travel around because you can pre-book your trains if you have a general idea of what your route and your plan is going to be. But I think for my book, for the nature of what it was, I didn't want to plan too much. I wanted to be quite sort of free to just hop on and off as and when I wanted. And the Rail Pass doesn't really lend itself to that because you do actually still have to make bookings. And if you then don't take that train, you have to sort of queue up to get it cancelled and refunded. And it was a real faff. So yes, I did wrap it up fairly quickly and move on. But otherwise, no, I've certainly used the pass before to travel around Europe and had a great time doing so.
Could you speak to us? We don't have the time to talk about every leg of the journey, but really fascinating leg to me was the one, I guess, across Russia and through, I think, Ulaanbaatar into China. Yeah. And this is another famous route for Western audiences. Could you speak about your experiences on that leg?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that most people sort of know of it as the Trans-Siberian train, which is, I think, the longest train in the world, the longest route in the world. But I chose not to actually take the Trans-Siberian. So it's not actually a specific train. There are 3 different routes that you can do to sort of cover that journey. There's the Trans-Siberian, which goes from Moscow right across to Vladivostok in the far east of Russia. Then there's the Trans-Mongolian, which is the one that I took. So instead of ending up in Vladivostok, you dip down through Mongolia and end up in Beijing as your final destination. And then there's a Trans-Manchurian where you also end up in Beijing, but you actually come through Manchuria rather than through Mongolia. And I think they take relative amounts of time. I think they take, more or less the same amount of time. But the only reason I didn't take the Vladivostok Trans-Siberian was because once you get there, there's not really an onward route, and you have to sort of, I guess you would have to come back.
Backtrack.
And most people just do it one way and then fly on to wherever they're going, and I didn't want to take any planes. So, yeah, I took the Trans-Mongolian, which was, I think, in total about 9 days. And with this train, you have to book each leg separately, and I didn't know that before I took it. And you have to name exactly which train you want to be on from Moscow to Ulaanbaatar and from Ulaanbaatar on to Beijing. And it's totally up to you where you break it up along the way, because the train has, I think, between Moscow and Irkutsk in Siberia, which is the first main big stop, there are about 80 train stations in between over 5 days. And it's absolutely up to you. If you want to hop off in between in Ekaterinburg or anywhere closer to Irkutsk, you're very welcome to do that. But obviously, because you're in a sleeper service, you have to sort of book those bits in between. But that 5 days was, I think, the longest I had on board any specific train. And it was certainly a very tough journey, because Siberia you think of as being sort of blustering cold and icy, but it was around 38 degrees at that time in June, and it was excruciatingly hot on board, and the air conditioning didn't work. And so most people were just sort of wandering around in slides and vest tops and, eating ice creams and hanging out in the dining car, just drinking from about 8 o'clock in the morning. But it was a fascinating trip in terms of just understanding space and distance and just getting to grips with that idea of traveling such a vast distance, which if you flew, you would have absolutely no concept of where you were at any given time or what you're passing through. And for me, it was one of the key journeys because it really showed up bits of the world that you would never normally see. And you could stand in the window at sort of 8 o'clock in the evening and see mists just swirling around, hour after hour of birch trees and pine. And you would never see that. You would never drive through it. You could never drive through it because there are no roads that take you through there, which is actually why most Russians actually use the train as a domestic service. And it's funny thinking of, for us, the Trans-Siberian is like a bucket list train, but for most of the people that I met on board, it was simply the only train that they could use to get anywhere, to visit family, or met a lawyer on board who had to use it every 2 weeks to go to court hearings. And he just said, it's hilarious for us that, people want to take this as a lifelong dream train. And he said it's so tedious for us and there's nothing for us to do but just eat dried fish and drink a few cans over 4 days to go and visit my mom or whatever. And again, it was, for me, fascinating to hear that perspective on it, that, for one person it's, a lifetime dream, and for someone else it's just a pain. And it was amazing but it was so fascinating to meet the people on board. And I was very lucky that this lawyer that we met actually he was bilingual, and I could chat to him in English and he would tell the other passengers why I was there and what I was doing. Because at the same time I did meet sort of quite obvious level of hostility when I was on board. So my husband and I were the only people of colour on board. And you could tell that people were just a bit uncertain as to why we were there and what we were doing. But once he'd said, this is their travel writers, she's traveling across here, this is what she's doing, they were very sweet. And they, invited us to sit in the compartments, they shared their food, they played cards with us. And often you don't need to speak the same language as other people because you still have this, innate human level with which you can interact. And you can still play cards and you can still share pancakes and listen to music and enjoy each other's company without having to be completely 100% sure about what you're discussing.
Right.
And it was an amazing journey for me because once we'd sort of got across that first 5 days, then made it across to Mongolia, and then finally 2 days later to Beijing, that feeling of having boarded a train in London and set off and got off in Beijing and not left the rails the whole time. I mean, certainly not to fly or to, take buses or cars or anything. To know that you could actually be overland all the way was quite something. And it really makes you think about just a spatial awareness of, watching from a window and seeing the world change in that way. And change so gradually. And I think when you fly, you're literally parachuted up from one place and dropped into another. And you have no concept of what the landscape looks like, how the topography is changing, how people's faces change. And it's all so gradual. It's really nuanced. It's really gentle, like undulating kind of changes, which you don't realize. And when you sort of hear people's language when you leave one place, and it only changes very gradually along the way until you arrive in China. But this way you could actually see things changing bit by bit. You could see currency kind of starting to change a bit. And then when you cross the border, some of the food was still similar on one side, but it was a little bit spicy, or, there was a bit of, cabbage and kimchi now in the noodles. And as you move towards Mongolia, the meat started to be a bit more, different, but it's still very Russian dumplings that you were eating. And just watching the way everything kind of melded together and then finally pull apart and you end up in China, you realize how similar people are. And that, we're always looking at the differences when actually we're very, very similar as people across the board. And you see that actually everybody really wants the same thing. And we're all only after, a roof over our heads and just being happy and getting from A to B. And we're not quite as different as I think people were set out to look for that. And it's a great train journey if you want to sort of get an idea of that sort of, it's almost like Middle Earth. To be able to see that from a train window at that ground level is something I would absolutely recommend to everybody to do one day.
That's a lovely description of the benefits and joys and the pleasures of traveling overland by rail. And I don't think you'll find a better one than that. And this idea of understanding this cosmopolitan idea of common humanity through the gradations of change that you see overland. I think that's just beautifully said. I think that's just a wonderful place to end the conversation. I guess if you don't mind, if I can ask you one more general question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, apart from what you've just said about traveling overland, perhaps traveling slowly, what advice would you give to a young traveler who is looking to not just do the typical kind of tourist route, but actually wants to have a transformative experience by that? Do you have any tips that come to mind?
Yeah, just step outside your comfort zone. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the most important things that I learned. And I, even though I've traveled a lot, I certainly pushed myself on this trip to do things that I wouldn't normally have felt I would be happy to do. Because it's only when you do that do you realize that you have so much more in you and capability than you realize. And, if you're nervous about going out in the evening to a restaurant where you don't know anybody, just go and do it, because you never know who you're going to meet and you never know what you're going to discover. And invariably, it's when you're really sort of apprehensive about something that you will find the most kind of transformative experiences. Mm-hmm. And don't be afraid to travel the way that you feel most comfortable as well, on the other hand, because I think there's a real kind of traveler one-upmanship that you constantly come across of, I traveled in this terrible compartment. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, mine was much worse, and I was more uncomfortable. But it doesn't matter if you feel better in a slightly nicer hostel or in a private room, that's fine. It's totally fine. You don't have to prove anything to anybody, least of all yourself. And if you want to travel in second class or first class, and that just makes it more enjoyable for yourself, do it. It's absolutely fine. But equally, if you do step outside your comfort zone, you might be really pleasantly surprised by what you find. And I think just not worrying about what other people think is a really important thing as well. And if you're just not someone who's comfortable eating certain foods or, trying certain drinks, or it's okay. It doesn't matter. And another thing that I think really struck me was this kind of reluctance to admit being a tourist and wanting to only be a traveler. Mm-hmm. There really is no difference between the two. If you're a stranger in a country and you've never been there before and you're out with your backpack and you're looking at a monument, you are a tourist. And there's nothing shameful about being a tourist somewhere. Mm-hmm. It's more about your own behavior and how you choose to deal with the place that you've gone to, and being aware of, being in a new place. And you're in someone else's country, you're in someone else's city. And that's the most important thing, I would say. When you travel, be really conscious of where you are and observe. Just don't talk too much, and you pick up a hell of a lot more. I think it's often if you arrive somewhere new, if you don't talk too much and you just listen and you try and draw in as much as you can, you'll get a much better feel for a place very quickly. And I think you'll find your feet much better and get a good understanding of what you're going to face and what it's going to be like. And just talk to people. Just talk to people as much as you can, and find out from people on the ground. That's the best way to do it. You don't have to listen to other travelers and take traveler advice all the time. You can always, even go on, read blogs from local people, follow local people on Instagram or Twitter, and find out where they eat and what they do and where they go out. And you'll often find that's a nice way of having, those authentic experiences that people look for when they go traveling. And it's a good way to find your feet. But most of all, travel. Absolutely do it. Just go. If you've scraped together enough money and you can manage it, just go, because you will never, ever regret traveling. You'll regret not traveling,
right?
But you definitely won't regret doing it.
Beautifully said. You should write a book. Well, thank you so much for talking with us and for your time. I know we had a bit difficulties with the scheduling, but thanks for.
Oh no, we finally got there. I'm really glad that we managed to do it. Yeah, thank you. It's been great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, can you just let everyone know where we can find you online, just in case we want to reach out?
Yeah, absolutely. My website, 80trains.com, which is quite easy to find. And I'm on Twitter, Monisha_Rajesh. And I'm on Instagram with the same handle, and very easy to find. And always very willing to offer, train advice or travel advice in general. So if people want to email me, they can contact me through the website. And I always respond personally to any mail. So, so do feel free to get in touch.
Good deal. Well, we'll put all of those links in the show notes. And, thank you. Thank you so much. And hope you have a nice weekend.
Yeah, thank you so much as well. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Talk to you later.
Cheers. Take care. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of All Over the Place. Don't forget to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app and follow us on social media. Please subscribe to our newsletter to receive emails with travel-related news, book recommendations, and resources from around the world. Links can be found at allovertheplacepodcast.com.